Strangely enough, my education about the mind of a baby didn't come in school. I didn't learn anything about that, even in the PhD program. And I was 16 years into my career, doing the best I could in therapy, when I decided to take a course in clinical applications of hypnosis. It was an immersion experience for me in the infant mind, because now I had a tool to explore memory. And I was taught to invite people to go back to whenever they first felt this way that they were coming to see me for. I didn't know that people could remember birth. So I just said, go back to when you first felt this way. And they would go places like birth or into the womb. And this was a total revelation to me. I had to, in fact, forget everything that I thought I knew about the mind of a baby, which I'd come to understand falsely, in retrospect, from science. It was an awkward position, but inspiring. Because what I found out was that infants had amazing memory, and in terms of science, there was no way to explain it. Neuroscience made no room for prenatal memory. The brain wasn't nearly complete enough, and it wasn't hooked up properly, so that the expectation in both psychology and medicine in 1974, when I took this course, was that, of course, babies couldn't remember anything. They didn't have the mind for it. And a lot of things followed from that basic belief that the baby couldn't interpret, since it didn't have enough brain, what it was feeling. It would not even know its own mother at birth. She would just be another object in the room. And it meant that pain was not a consideration in medicine, because that would require a certain amount of brain matter. And since the baby didn't have it, they couldn't have the pain. This led to strange behaviors on the part of obstetricians and neonatologists and pediatricians. This is the medical group that deals with babies. They weren't thinking that anybody was there that they had to worry about. Because of this basic belief in science and psychology that there wasn't enough brain power for babies to have any authentic emotion or much of any sensation, and no sense of pain, they were unrestrained in what they could do for the baby to save its life and so on. So what they turned out doing was in direct conflict with the actual baby. And they managed to stick with that belief through decades. In terms of physical comfort, babies were put in strange positions when they were birthed from what they were used to. They were used to this nice curved environment where there were no corners and edges and sharp places. Nothing was straight in the womb. But to take a baby out by the heels and upside down was a spinal adjustment no baby would ask for. It was painful. Putting them on flat surfaces was inappropriate to the babies, but in obstetrics, they thought nothing of it. Sometimes babies were hit in the course of birth because they weren't breathing. And that was the boomeranging of the anesthetics that they had been given. So they had to be resuscitated. Well, that whole awkward process wasn't very nice for the babies. They knew they were being hit, but they felt innocent and couldn't understand why they were being hurt. They're acting like they're being tortured. Their faces are grimaced, and they're tense. They're very uncomfortable. But in spite of all the yelling and crying and screaming, which is absolutely typical of the American way of birth, crying babies are everywhere. Nobody was paying serious attention to this performance. It was the strongest kind of nonverbal message that a baby could come up with. And it was unrestrained. I mean, when you think of the power and the strength of babies complaining and crying and protesting at birth, it's very impressive. And some of them actually said to me, I'm protesting as strongly as I know. I'm crying as loud as I can, but nobody cares. Now, here we're back to the kind of the delusional thinking of the obstetricians who are imagining a different baby than the one who's right there. I think they're hallucinating a baby more to their liking, who submits to whatever they want to do without complaining. And they simply are applying what they thought they learned in anatomy and in neuroscience, that since the baby hasn't a proper mind, an adequate mind, it can't say anything. Its communications are non-communications. There's this to be said about our behavior, that it very much follows what we deeply believe. And when it comes to deeply held beliefs, the facts aren't terribly persuasive. At least they're not necessarily persuasive. If you have a deep enough reason for believing what you believe, you override any new information. And so, for that reason, it can take generations for new medical students to finally get it and arrive at the place that they're the obstetricians delivering the babies, and they have other thoughts than the ones they were taught. But the belief system, I think, explains a lot. If you put yourself in the shoes of an obstetrician, learning that what they've been doing for 20 years or 30 years has been very hurtful, that's hard to live with, because they didn't go into medicine to hurt babies. And they don't quite know how to shake what they learned in anatomy, because they believe that's got to be bedrock truth. But that's a limitation in medicine. To have reduced everything to how much brain matter people have was a terrible mistake. They're not quite aware of that yet. And this is what makes the confrontation of professionals with babies difficult. When I took this course in hypnosis, I had a tool to invite people to go into their own memory in a way that they didn't expect to do. And what I discovered was they were amazingly sharp in their perceptions. And it didn't seem to have anything to do with how old they were. They were clearly, they clearly acted like they had a self. They knew whether they were loved or not, wanted or not. And they knew how they were being treated. It's like there was never a time when they didn't know how they were being treated. The mom and dads live very much in 20th century science, except for the exceptional parents who knew better in the first place. And they're still handicapped by the ideas about lack of brain. And so they're thinking that parenthood starts after birth, when the baby has a chance to think about things and could become a person gradually. But what I learned was there was no gradual, nothing gradual about it. The babies knew who they were from whenever I tapped into their memory. And eventually I had to cope with the fact that it was not a developmental process I was looking at. Like in developmental psychology, the development of everything is staged. And everything is gradual. It doesn't just happen. It isn't just there. You don't expect it to be just there. You expect it to develop slowly over a long period of weeks and months and years. When I realized that there was something there before the brain, and it wasn't all about the brain, and that was an awareness. It took me a while to name it, but there was an awareness, a human awareness, a human consciousness, a human intelligence that was not accounted for by brain development. It was something more, which I came finally to articulate as a human trait. It comes with humans. It is who we are. But science didn't teach us that. They reduced what a human being is to brain matter. And as I like to say, if you didn't have the brain matter, you didn't matter. You couldn't be anything without that brain matter. Well, I learned this immediately from the birth memories and the womb memories and the conception memories and the memories of when mother discovered she was pregnant. That is such a sensitive and potent moment for an aware baby, because mother is likely to be very dramatic one way or the other at this time. It's, oh my God, I can't be pregnant. My husband will kill me. Or, oh, it is the answer to all my prayers. Wait until Bill finds out that we're pregnant. Now, I was listening to the baby's version of all this. And so I was catching on to the fact that the babies knew much more than we ever gave them credit for. They were using perhaps the same intelligence that was guiding them from when the egg hit the sperm and all through the 9 months of development, which is superbly intelligent activity. Amazing purpose driving a construction project like nothing in the world. So complex. Teams working here, teams working there. And when their work is finished, it comes together to form the whole. The process of embryology has never been well explained scientifically, because it's this happens, that happens, this happens, that happens. It's like there's no story. And when I got serious about studying embryology, after listening to the babies talk, I began to see there was an amazing story to embryogenesis. Here was intelligence before there was any brain whatsoever. And that discovery made it possible for me to begin to really believe in the human nature, the human intelligence, the human awareness of the baby, because it was everywhere you looked. It was all there, no matter how old they were. And I'll tell you something else that helped me to put this into place very quickly. It was in 1975. I learned hypnosis in 1974, and I was accumulating all these memories that kept popping in about birth and life in the womb. A friend gave me Raymond Moody's book for Christmas, Life After Life. And I learned from that when people went on their near-death journeys, they didn't take their brains with them. They rose out of their bodies, saw, heard, what with? All of their physical equipment was back on the operating table. They went to other realms. They were beautifully counseled, marvelously loved. They had great knowing. They made big decisions about values. And they decided to return to their bodies. Well, they had no brain aboard for any of that. Yet they came back memorizing all of it. They had memorized it with what? I was beginning to get it that the mind of the baby was not the brain. It was more than the brain. And I realized that we needed a whole new paradigm to describe accurately the nature of a human baby. I observed that the babies had a functioning mind. And I ended up titling my book, The Mind of Your Newborn Baby, for that reason. In medicine, when they talk about mind, that's just a euphemism for brain. They don't really believe you need an extra concept for mind. And I think what this underscores is the great separation in belief between generally Eastern belief systems, whether it's psychology, like in Buddhism, or Western tradition, as in our kind of academic psychology. The two didn't mix easily. And I think we could call this the politics of science, which was not true to scientific principles. It was a betrayal of true science, where you follow the truth wherever it leads you, no matter who gets shocked in the process. And an illustration was this, an illustration of this in our 20th century development of psychology is pretty obvious. William James wrote the first textbook for American psychology, and it included the whole spectrum of mind activity, meditation, hypnosis, altered states, psychic abilities, everything. But the American Psychological Association was very conscious of being accepted as a science. And so they decided that consciousness was out of bounds for them. So they put aside William James and all in order to be very obviously scientific. And they lost a very great deal. And it took half a century to begin to recover what they thought they had put aside, because it kept creeping back. And one of the things that crept back was hypnosis and psychic phenomena. So I discovered that the babies had many abilities that science had not acknowledged. In fact, I would say that in the 20th century, both psychology and medicine missed the real baby. And it was only because they restricted their beliefs to what were comfortable at the time. I found that the babies were living very much in mother's aura, so to speak. Mother was a dominating figure, and if mother was upset, you could be pretty sure the baby would end up upset. If the mother was happy, the baby would know that and feel good about that. The baby was able to discriminate the state of consciousness in the mother from the state of consciousness in the father, or in siblings who had already arrived in that family. Babies knew, for example, that their coming was going to make it harder for a male child this is a girl child that I'm talking about, because he was already having trouble getting his father's attention. And now with her coming, his situation would be worse. So she felt sorry for him. She felt compassion and insight and wisdom. Others would say about their mother, I really understand my mother. I know my mother. But my father, I don't know. I don't have any idea where he is. I don't know what's on his mind. I don't know what he's thinking. They could perceive that. On the other hand, I discovered that babies were not necessarily geniuses or gurus. They were not coming into this world as finished products, so they could easily sort out circumstantial evidence. They needed help with that. They were sort of overwhelmed by the mother's fear or the father's anger or the doctor's clumsiness. And they were learning that medicine was bad for them. Some learned that medical procedures brought them near death and were torturous. They were operated on with no anesthetic because the doctors believed babies didn't need it. This went on for 150 years after the discovery of ether. The belief was so strong that babies didn't have the brains to know what was happening, and so it wouldn't matter. That seems amazing from our point of view. But if you look at something like circumcision, how that happened in the medical community, I've heard lots of stories from interns about this, that when they found themselves next to their teacher doing a circumcision, being taught how to do it, without any anesthetic, of course, the babies looked like they were extremely uncomfortable and being tortured. And the students would usually say to their supervisor, who's very calm about this whole thing, "Isn't that baby in pain?" And the professor would say, "Don't worry about it. The baby won't remember anything of this and doesn't have enough brain to interpret what's happening. So it's not going to make any difference." What I found, of course, was that pain made every difference, that the babies always knew when they were in pain. And the worse it was, the worse they reacted. There are little premature babies who had major heart surgery for an hour and a half with no anesthetic for pain. In fact, they were knocked out with curare, a form of curare, which is a muscle paralyzer. And this meant that they couldn't react in any way during the surgery. And that only helped the surgeons to be even more convinced that nothing was happening here that would possibly hurt a baby. Well, when I heard a baby describe its circumcision, I was very uncomfortable. And that baby was very uncomfortable and was living through minute by minute of torture and gasping, trying to live through it. Now, the kind of deep impression that leaves with a baby doesn't just go away. The baby has a perfectly good memory. And it may be a very deep kind of memory that they can't recite for you except in an altered state of some kind. But it's always there guiding how they actually behave. So, for example, if they have been through terrible pain in the neonatal intensive care nursery for 3 months, where most procedures are painful every day, they can't act as though they are ignorant of what happened to them. They live it in how they behave. They are guarded they're armored, they're expecting things. And when things start happening that are anything like what they went through where they were helpless, then the babies become neurotic. They're driven in how they behave. It's not an objective matter. They're responding to the torture that they experienced. In 20th century science, all memory was brain-based. And they thought you couldn't have it yet if you didn't have all of your brain. And they knew that all the brain wasn't there at birth. So they invented all their protocols around a bad assumption that there was no brain working there. And that situation hasn't entirely resolved yet. But what I was compelled to accept was that memory is ageless, and it has more to do with the non-material mind than it does with the material brain. This explained to me how it was always there when the brain wasn't. What I found was that even babies in the womb could have near-death experiences during an attempted abortion when they lived through it, but a twin partner died. And they could tell me that story. Now we call that the vanishing twin syndrome. It's the syndrome of the surviving twin who was there during the first semester experiencing and observing the death of its twin. Now you have very little brain development in that first trimester, and yet it was a deeply buried memory. And it was driving these people. This is why I refer to it as a syndrome. They were depressed about something, but they couldn't say what it was. They were pushing in their behavior to make up for things. They had a compulsion to find twins and observe twins. And they were hesitant about forming deep relationships because nothing would compare with the one they lost. All of these were very psychic driving factors in their mind that they couldn't explain because they didn't know the memory in their conscious mind. And so, yes, there's a sense that there is a kind of memory that is brain-based, or we sometimes say cellular. And there is another kind of deeper memory that doesn't require these cells until you need to talk about it. You do need your brain if you want to describe your near-death experience. But you can have the experience and recall everything before your brain has begun to be much of a brain. The same was true of past life memories, again, which is very unwelcome data in science. It's just very uncomfortable to psychology. They don't teach this sort of thing. They're embarrassed about it. But people keep coming up with these memories, and they've been scientifically investigated backwards and forwards, volume after volume of good scientific work. And science turns a blind eye. But what it means about memory is that memory is not material, because there is no material connection between one lifetime and another. If the memory is in the brain, we know the brain dies after a lifetime and turns to dust. How can we explain that when a baby is coming in, I hear the baby talk about confusion between how it died and how it's being born? because similar things are happening. And the baby, in its mind, is awkwardly trying to negotiate both spaces. And so they're describing with great anxiety things leading up to their death. And on the other hand, with anxiety about what's happening in the delivery room. So my answer to your question about mind and cellular brain stuff is that the two have to be integrated. And we don't do this very well in a conscious state of mind. Those deeper memories tend to stay there and keep driving us automatically in our fears and anxieties and in our compulsiveness. And we don't know why. In an altered state, you can usually reach it, as I did in hypnosis. And then there's an opportunity to integrate and realign around the truth as we can see it now. I'm always helping babies, in a sense, to redo what they came to a hurried decision about when they were in the womb. Like they did something wrong to be there. They've upset everybody. This is going to ruin their lives. And so they begin to think of themselves as dangerous people. So this is the integration that many of us have to work out somehow. We don't do it very well without help, but with certain kinds of help, we can do it quite well. In my therapeutic work, I've had to come to terms with the impression that this life makes on us. And I see it happening in the tender, open minds of the babies who don't seem to know any better at the time that they're facing these sudden and violent circumstances, that they sort of lose their sense of whatever they thought they were before. But also, if you follow people on in life, you do become very aware that some are much wiser than other people. They have a much broader scope of how they're approaching things, even though they're somewhat handicapped by conditioning in this world through things usually that were violent, that where they had such a shock. It's like they couldn't hang on to their inner wisdom, and they've had to fight for that. They've had to get that back. That we all seem to be here for a purpose, and we have a course of experiences that are our curriculum. And I see those as challenging us at our weakest points. Obviously, we're trying to learn something, and so we're facing things that help us to get that issue resolved, get that issue clear. And that's what I end up doing to help my clients, where they've been stuck with fears and anxieties that developed as conditioning in this world. I help them to see their path of learning rather than to get lost in blaming and thinking that if only other people would treat me in a perfect way, then I could be okay. I call it job one, to proceed with your own evolution and to become more and more yourself, more your true self. So we're dealing with false selves most of the time that have arisen in terms of danger or fear and anxiety about acceptance. And I find that orienting back to who you truly are in terms of your virtues and qualities that you brought with you, like the wise woman or the wise man, that has such power when compared with all these half-truths or false senses of who you are, that really inspire therapy, get people into therapy in the first place. What I've noticed about all the people that come suffering from something is that it goes back to the conditioning that you're talking about. And it isn't the history that matters. It's what you make of it that matters. And here's where I bring the two realms together. In this world, we seem to be constantly perturbed. And that's just another word for conditioning. Circumstances of life here on planet Earth are not ideal for anyone. This is not heaven, this is Earth. And I get the impression that being here is to be perturbed and be challenged all the time, as we would be in any good school situation. It's not a free ride, it's not a country club, it's not a place to just get drunk. It's a real school. And so every grade and every lesson has some purpose. And as I work with people's lives and they come and tell me their history, I see how they got tangled in their history. And where I see they got tangled is by making something out of it that it wasn't. And this is where I refer to false images of self. Because to me, what people believe about themselves is probably the most important thing. And it's probably the highest level of lesson spiritually, to really know your true self and incorporate and be your wise person, be balanced, and all of those things. All of that is potentially possible, but in this buzzing, blooming confusion of a world, we're constantly challenged what we make of what's confronting us. And the images that I pay most attention to are the images they form of themselves. So what I use as a reflection is the idea of the true you, the true self, which is the virtues, character that you've been working on for a long, long time, applied in this challenging and confusing and perturbing situation. And that's what the therapy consists of these days, of freeing up these false images and reclaiming true images. And when that happens, history is nothing. It's just grist for the mill. We can think back to it and smile or laugh about it, but it doesn't hold us down anymore. It doesn't control us. And here I see a weaving of mind and cellular stuff, including brain, that this planet is the school where we practice getting it right, namely being who we truly are, and not getting lost in our history or our conditioning. But I'm speaking in generalities now about the dilemma that parents faced. They had to operate with the ideas that were current in our culture. And that was that you didn't really have a baby until after birth. Everything up to that point was waiting for something, waiting for somebody. So that ladies in waiting were women who didn't have a baby to parent yet, but they were trying to do the right things. And medicine is still stuck pretty much there. Prenatal visits are all about that stuff. How's your body doing? Are you taking your vitamins? How's your blood sugar? Let's have a look at your blood sugar. Or let's take a picture of your baby with ultrasound and see if its growth process is all right, or it's on schedule. All of that is physical stuff, and parents were full of that, just as the scientists were. And that's what obstetricians thought was their job. They didn't prepare women for childbirth, and they don't today. prenatal visits don't prepare women for childbirth. So I think it very much depends on what parents think, how they behave. And in the 20th century, they were on a slippery slope because what they were taught was not true. And it kept them from opening their hearts fully to the baby and engaging in relationship from the get-go. I mean, before conception. We have a whole new literature in our field of prenatal psychology now, based on parent reports of how their babies communicated with them before conception. Now, this is the new paradigm of intelligence and consciousness. The babies are something before they even start having a physicalness. They negotiate with parents about being born. They remind parents about an agreement they have. They press their case. And parents change their mind. As a result, we have hundreds of these stories now in print. On our website, we have a whole long column of stories on communication before conception. Well, if you know as a parent that your baby is a spiritual entity like yourself, before entering this physical world, that's a mind-blowing idea. It is truly revolutionary. And if they're open to it, they will behave entirely differently from way before. They'll prepare for the conception, not just for the birth. Now, with this idea in mind, the intelligence of the baby, it's never a dummy. It has a mind. It's reaching out to you, the parents. It means that every week of pregnancy is important. There's no wasted time. There's no throwaway time. There aren't months that don't count for anything. Embryology clearly shows us, boy, things are happening now, and they don't stop happening now. Development in the womb is jet speed, although it seems very slow because it's 9 months. So I think parenting needs to be completely redesigned around different ideas, and the ideas are about baby consciousness and baby intelligence. I think it's a marvelously exciting new chapter because instead of having the first 9 months blank or essentially meaningless because you think nobody's there, you have a buddy. You have a child, you have a human being that's joining you. And this makes life in the womb very different. It's something to be shared, not something to be hidden from the baby. Babies being smart in the womb are trying to figure out the problems that parents are getting into, but they're at a great disadvantage in this material world. They're likely to get the wrong idea. So in this case, parents who know that the babies have this deeper intelligence can explain what's happening to the baby and ease the baby's mind. Babies are perfectly able to make important decisions in the womb. In fact, this is one of the hot things about miscarriages and abortions, that if you think nobody's home, then you do abortions in a different state of mind. And if you're the parent doing the abortion, the state of mind that you usually have is a state of guilt and anxiety and angst and regret and conflict. Almost all mothers facing abortion have that state of mind. But when they switch over to a new concept of who's there. As an intelligent being who's listening to you and loves you anyway, and wants to be with you, and plans to be with you, who is upset because they don't understand why it can't happen now. When that mother and that child have a heart-to-heart dialogue, a full dialogue about what's happening and why the decision and what's important to the mother, guess what? They arrive at an understanding. The child can say, okay. The mother can say, and the child can say, I love you. They part to become united at a later time. There is no guilt. And, again, guess what? There's a miscarriage before there's any need for the abortion. If a parent has been proceeding from before conception, engaged in dialogue, full dialogue with the child all along, then the birth is going to be dramatically different than if it had been the other way around. A birth will express the unity of the mother and the baby that has already been created. It's a delicate unity that obstetrics and medicine cannot quite grasp. They come in and interrupt these subtle rhythms of the mother and the baby. The baby fully expects to help mother with the birth. In fact, it is the baby who creates the hormones that end the pregnancy and begin the labor. If the baby's afraid, then the labor comes premature, and we have more and more premature babies in our society. It's a very serious cultural problem for those babies. And it's another illustration of what I was saying about conditioning. The baby is developing fear because of what's happening to the parents. They're afraid for their well-being, and they need reassurance of some kind that it's okay to stay there. But if a parent is not able to treat that, not able to be in dialogue with the baby, then it doesn't get resolved, and we have premature babies who shouldn't be born yet. Now, the birth that will happen if the relationship, the good relationship of the mother and baby has not been interfered with, can hardly happen in the hospital because they want to manage the birth. It's their concept of birth is management. If they don't manage it, they don't do their job. And they're afraid that if they don't manage it, the mother and the baby will ruin it. And obstetrics lives in fear these days. So management is their solution to fear. Home birth and water birth are places where mothers and babies are least likely to be interrupted in the natural flow of energy and hormones that bring a baby easily into this world. And the pictures of this where it's done right are just so beautiful, so amazing. The mother who's laboring and spiraling in bliss as she labors to bring this baby out into the water, into a tub, is something that you have to do a double take because it's not of this world. It's so far to the other extreme from how we do American birth that it's almost inconceivable. Are they kidding? Who's fooling who here? So somehow we need to tame obstetrics. We need to educate obstetricians about the psychology of the baby, especially the prenatal baby, so that they can put their illusions aside and deal with the baby that's there, not the baby in their imagination. We need them to step back and interfere less, to be ready in cases of emergency, but not to interfere as a way of doing birth. The interference is what throws things out of gear and then complicates the delivery and the need to interfere more and more profoundly. So I think we have our hands full to make birth appropriate for the baby we know and the mother we know. The ironic thing about obstetrics, as successful as it was in the 20th century, was that they overlooked the psychology of the mothers as well as the babies. They had no psychology worth anything. We have exported this modern type of birth. In all parts of the world, they're eating it up. They want to be like us. They're so busy copying us. And they're not aware that they're digging deeper into all of our problems. They're not likely to find liberty in birth doing it our way. And I am concerned about civilization. It's been a preoccupation of mine, especially this year, since it's the last chapter in my forthcoming book. And the chapter is about birth and civilization. I'm trying to make the connections real and understandable. And what I'm observing is that the way we're doing birth, which is an interruption in the mother and child bond and rhythm, and the aggressiveness of obstetrics is not going to lead us where we need to go to act civilized in the end. In other words, I'm seeing that the beginning is a necessary foundation for how it ends. And I think we're very delusional about civilization, just like we've been about circumcision. And it's the same delusion. If we torture babies, where do we get off thinking they're going to turn into wonderful, peaceful, loving citizens? This is crazy thinking. If we disturb the relationship of mothers and babies at birth, then how do we think we're going to have wonderful relationships between mothers and babies of harmony and deep bonding and respect and honor coming out of that when it's been trashed in the birth process? I think we're kidding ourselves that we can ruin birth, fail at birth, and still pick up our reward in civilization. It's not going to be there. I think when we brutalize babies, we plant the seeds of destruction of our civilization in them. And they don't know any better. They just act it out. Someone once said, as we treat the babies will treat the world. And this is a great truth. We're kidding ourselves that if we just wish for civilization, it's not going to come to pass. What it's going to take are very refined, wise people, disposed to cooperation, to acceptance of the whole human family as valid, and all people as part of this valid family? Or we won't have a civilized society. We won't be civil to one another. Somehow we think that 1,000 Walmarts in China will make them more civilized. Or if we just have more millionaires or billionaires in the United States, we are then, by definition, the most civilized of all countries. This is delusional thinking. We can't get there that way. We need people who come out of the womb smiling. And we're not getting that. In our country especially, with obstetrical approach, we have babies coming out of the womb, kicking and screaming and protesting as loudly as their little lungs can do it. And we're not paying attention. The smiling babies have a chance of creating a smiling society, a happy society, a tolerant society, a loving society, a cooperative society. Then we may be talking about civilization. But what if only 1 out of 1,000 comes out smiling? What is that going to result in our civilization? I think it's time we woke up about the realities of birth in our time. We're doing it wrong. It's not a model for the world. It's not a model for our time. We haven't found the right model. At least the people who are doing it right are very rare. And as Bucky Fuller used to point out, we need a critical mass in order to expect our whole society to turn around and for it to be really civilized and not barbaric as it is now.